serious should elderly people be said to take tests regarding their motor vehicle operating abilities and mental fitness and get their motor vehicle license revoked if they fail the test? Why not? My grandpa was in his late 80s or early 90s when he caused a minor fender bender on the way to a doctor's appointment. A couple of days later, he was having brain surgery to fix a bleed that resulted from the accident. After he recovered, he was required to retake the driving test. His doctor sent in documentation saying he was medically unfit to drive. My dad sent in some documents saying he lived in town and would make sure my grandpa had transportation as needed. He was absolutely dangerous on the road and in the early stages of dementia. The state of Florida gave him back his license. Illinois does this. Info from Google. Specifically, Illinois requires drivers age 75 and older to renew their licenses in person. Requires both a vision test and road test for drivers ages 75 and older renewing in person. Requires drivers ages 81 through 86 to renew their license every 2 years. And those 87 and older to renew annually. When I took my 17-year-old daughter for the road test, she was waiting with an older man who was taking his first road test since he was a teen. They were both equally nervous. Yes, my grandma was still able to drive, even though she could barely push the brake pedal all the way down. My grandpa had seizures and eventually had his license taken away because he wouldn't take his meds and had a seizure while driving more than once. My husband's grandpa drove into a ditch because he couldn't multitask adjusting the heat vents while driving. Yes, my 91-year-old grandmother has macular degeneration, cataracts, and is in the early stages of dementia. She failed her eye exam at one DMV, but went to another DMV and somehow passed. She should not be driving as she's going to eventually hurt someone else, herself, or get completely lost at it. I didn't expect this to gain any attention at all. For clarification, she lives in a small town of 600 people. The closest city with Uber is 45 minutes away. She's still capable of living on her own for now. I think the only reason my family hasn't taken any action to stop her from driving is if something happens to her and she needs to drive to the hospital. I do not condone her driving whatsoever and have no control over the situation. My uncle and cousin live in the same town and help her get where she needs to go. The only time she drives, that I'm aware of, is to a small grocery store about a quarter of a mile down her road. Maybe small towns could start initiatives for teens or adult volunteers to drive the elderly around and get them basic house necessities. Absolutely. I'm an auto adjuster and I once had his couple around 70 cause a terrible rear end accident while merging on the freeway. The old man was driving and got confused somehow and hit someone going full speed. The old lady had a chihuahua on her lap and the airbag hit it. They took it to a vet, but it died the next day. I had to pay for its euthanasia bill. Other pro had minor injuries. The man sounded so broken on the phone. They never got another car and their little companion died. Their daughter called me to see if there was anything in the police report that explained why it happened, and of course there wasn't. My parents are the same age and ride around with little dogs. My mom says that sometimes my dad looks like he forgets that he's driving and takes his hands off the wheel, and she has to yell at him to stop. I'm literally going to report him to their Secretary of State if she doesn't take him to get a test soon. I live in rural Wales. There is duck all in terms of public transport here, and some people, especially the older generations, live remotely. However, there are a lot of issues of older people driving into town and causing minor accidents, doing odd things at roundabouts etc. Been a lot of near misses with pedestrians that I've personally witnessed, and recently, an old woman who died in a crash that involved no other cars. The general thought is that she drove too close to curb, which caused her to spin out. I think at age 70 then you should have to be observed over an hour drive by a licensed instructor, as well as having a doctor sign off on your eye sight etc. Rural areas of Britain also need far better public transport links. However, caused a lot of old people are really said to keep driving by how it is. Personally, I'm hoping to be rich and flamboyant enough to have a chauffeur drive me around in a pink convertible. My EXS great aunt who was 98 once told us she didn't check her blind spot anymore because it made her dizzy and blackout, so yes 100 yes. I also have no clue to this day how my nan every passed her test in her 70s. She can't drive to save her life. Had she been 18 they would have failed her 100. Yes, I'm a young, healthy 27-year-old who uses a wheelchair and drives an adapted van. Because of this I must be tested every few years. I have never had an accident. I have 0 demerit points and have never even been pulled over. However, old people that mix up the gas and brake pedals and can't remember to put on their lights at night get a free pass to drive until they kill someone. My grandfather early 80s got into a car accident a few years ago, backed into someone, and my grandmother, whose Alzheimer's has been growing steadily worse for several years, still is allowed to drive, possibly not now that they live in a home, but before they did. I distinctly remember her driving us to the grocery store and her forgetting where we were going, the turn off back to her house, and so on. I do believe they, and other older folks, should have to take another driver's test, like others are saying. I agree people in general should be retested every few years, maybe not terribly often, but I wouldn't mind retaking it every 10 years or so, maybe even more frequent with age, if that would help there to be fewer accidents. Sadly I'm having this issue with my father. He thinks I'm evil because both myself and mother think it's safer. My 74-year-old father doesn't drive due to cognitive impairment, visual difficulties, and think at times due to medication he isn't compus mentis enough to be driving safer for him and other drivers and pedestrians. Sometimes you have to make the big decisions, the hard choices for the better, not just to make someone happy. It'll be the bad guy, but at least people would be safe. What? Absolutely. But I wouldn't even say apply it only to the elderly. Everybody should periodically have to redo the driving tests. I say about every 10 years. They do a road test when you are a teen and never again. Like any license, you should have to pass a test every few years to keep the license edit. To reply to many of the commenters, yes, I realize it could be prohibitively expensive to road test every driver every 5 years. Maybe 10 years is better than every 2 years after 65. But I think with technology the way that it is, we could design a road test that could be done by a machine in a simulator where it gauges reaction time, adherence to laws and that kind of thing. I think it might be a good idea to road test people who have had multiple moving violations. I also think it would be a good idea to regularly give people a written test by computer just to keep people updated. The cost of doing nothing is higher insurance premiums, more death by vehicle, and the fact that there is a real risk to letting people drive who no longer have the cognitive function to do so. My point was, I was given a road test at 17, and since then, the only other time I've had to prove any ability is a written test when I moved out of state. Other than that, I renew my license by mail and haven't been to a DMV in years. Absolutely. Actually, I think it should be a requirement for everyone to pass a driving test every 5-10 years. Do you know how many people legitimately don't understand fundamental rules of the road because they either lucked out or simply forgot? The written exams are so ridiculously easy for many states. If anything, they should heighten the standards for everyone, not just the elderly, to get a license. So many bad drivers out there. I have seen so many accidents in cities that were so unavoidable, but there are too many people with unsafe habits on the road. While limited to just elderly people, everyone picks up bad habits. Road conditions and laws change all the time, and people forget stuff. Just make it so you get retested every 5-10 years. Job done. Safer roads, more income, and no accusations of age discrimination. I think this one is a no-brainer. You need to be tested every few years for most licenses. So why not also for a driving license? Only testing 16-18-year-old kids is a shoddy practice in my mind. Things change. You could even avoid the age discrimination argument by requiring that everyone be retested every couple years, not just those 50 or 65. Sadly, I doubt that any such system like that would be implemented, regardless of care taken to not discriminate. There are roadblocks, pun intended. Just off the top of my head, AARP would turn the legislation into an attack on the elderly. As America's largest special interest group, and one that caters mostly to America's largest VTER group, you lose a key demographic other special interest groups, those for drivers, etc. would potentially have an issue with it, as it's an inconvenience, it'd be an infrastructural headache. The DMV DPS is already woefully understaffed in most places, and people hate going there. Requiring motorists to go back more often would inundate those places even more. Requiring motorists to go to the DMV more often is a hard sell, especially when you invariably have to pay some extortionist fee. It would help with VTER registration though. What with the Motor VTER Act? Take that as you will, TLDR. Yes. I don't even know how my grandma is still allowed to drive. I'm legitimately scared to drive with her. She's bound to cause an accident soon. In New Zealand you have to renew your license when you turn 75 and 80, and then every 2 years after that. You also have to bring a medical certificate to show a doctor thinks you're safe to drive. Yes. To avoid the age discrimination argument, I would be perfectly happy to get retested every 5 years if this meant that everyone had to. Yes. It should be something we are consistently tested on. Every 5-10 years maybe, then more frequent as you get older. I've always felt this way, but I just recently learned that someone I went to high school with died in a car accident because an 88-year-old man was driving on the wrong side of the highway in broad daylight. It was just last week. The following contains a somewhat graphic description of what happened. This guy was 26 years old, driving to go home or meet some friends on a weekday morning, and he met his death in the form of a fiery car crash that left 60 of his body covered in third-degree burns. He was stuck in the car for 20 minutes before they got him out. He was on life support for 4 days before they pronounced him brain dead and let him go. He passed away Saturday. I barely knew this person and hadn't spoken to him in years, but the fact that his life was stolen from him and he died, most likely in tremendous amounts of pain and fear, in a way none of us can imagine going, makes me so angry for him and his family. That man should not have been driving. He entered a major roadway on the wrong side because he was confused, and ended up ending his own life and the life of someone who had only just started his journey. We need to have people test and test and test again to make sure everyone driving is a safe and able driver. Edited to add the timeline.